How's it going, everyone? We are here. I am your host, Russell Clay. You can find me on Twitter at Russell J. Clay. We are here to make some tree-based decisions with our DFS lineups, and I'm joined by Renee Miller. How's it going, Renee?
Pretty good, Russ. How are you this morning?
A little groggy, but whatever. Like, that's fine. And you know what, the viewers, that's fine, guys. We're fine.
Yeah.
So in terms of how we make our decisions in DFS, I guess give a little thought behind the article and what sort of motivated this process for you.
Yeah, the part I like best about daily fantasy is the puzzle aspect of it, is fitting all the different pieces together each week, knowing that each week it's going to be a different solution. So just relying on what worked last week or last season isn't going to be your best way through the forest. Sticking with the tree metaphor.
There you go.
So
I like it.
I came up with an idea that really based on who your starting point is for your lineup, or what your starting philosophy is any given week, is really going to limit your choices with what else you can do. And being aware of that and how different starting points lead to building different lineups, it's interesting. It's interesting to me, but it can also being aware that ahead of time can make you feel a little bit more empowered about those decisions, so that you're not just putting players in at the end that you're left with, because that's what you're stuck with. If you try to approach it ahead of time and just know that every time you put a player in your lineup, you're limiting your options for the other slots. And are you doing that on purpose?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the, bases to starting the building process. Like, which players do you like? You should definitely be mapping that out. I mean, especially with how, competitive things are now, you kind of have to go into the lineup process with like, all right, I'm paying up with this specific receiver. What does that leave me in terms of, running backs, blah, blah, blah. And I guess that'll bring us into our first topic here. You listed Odell Beckham and Antonio Brown as sort of a starting point. What do you see there?
Yeah, so I think this is a great approach in week one, is that you really want to start out with some expensive wide receivers. And I said, it's not hard to do, right? You can get Odell Beckham Jr. and Antonio Brown, or Brown and Julio Jones, or DeAndre Hopkins, or whoever you like there at the top. You can do it. You can fit two of these guys, even three, if you really want to stretch it, into your lineup. But if you do that, where do you go from there? So I think one of the first mistakes that people might make with this kind of strategy is trying to stack the quarterback of that receiver. So immediately saying, okay, I have Odell Beckham Jr., I have Antonio Brown, I need to use Eli Manning or Ben Roethlisberger, both of whom are pretty expensive. And I think there's other reasons to go away from that approach here too. One is that Eli Manning has had some of his worst games, or had some of his worst games last year in this matchup with Dallas. So not that what happened last year is a sure promise of what's going to happen this year, but it's something to consider at his price point.
Absolutely. And I think Dallas is still going to try to play that slower pace that might limit some of the, passing attempts for Eli. So I definitely agree there. And yeah, in terms of stacking, I mean, we have that one guy sort of everyone's been talking about, which is Dak Prescott. And I think he makes the lineup process with these guys pretty easy.
Yep. And if you're going cheap, he's the one to go with. I mean, I'm not messing around with Sean Hill or Carson Wentz at all this week.
No. Carson Wentz is one where I'm like, all right, he literally got named the starter a week ago, and he's a rookie, and that's just tragic. And yeah, with Roethlisberger, I mean, is there anything there?
I mean, he's fine. I just don't think you need to spend that much at quarterback. I think even if you want to go, Derek Carr or somebody middle of the road, I recommended in the article a little cheap stack to balance out these wide receivers, because Spencer Ware is so cheap, Alex Smith is so cheap, and Macklin is very reasonable as well. So That's where I'm going most of the time. I think the Chiefs have a really nice implied team total this week. Alex Smith is Alex Smith. He's going to get you 17 to 22 fantasy points a week
every week.
It's very safe.
And he's the sneakiest rushing yard guy in the league, so he certainly got that floor as well.
Yeah.
So in terms of a guy that I like quite a bit this week, but it's still uncomfortable paying up for that quarterback, like you mentioned, Aaron Rodgers is someone you mentioned as an expensive quarterback. What are you doing with him? How are you working this on DraftKings?
Well, it's always that. I mean, we talked a little bit about stacking in the first case, and if you start with a receiver, you don't necessarily have to go that way. But if you start with a quarterback and you want to take advantage of all the potential scoring that can stack up with that quarterback and his receivers, be they wide receivers or pass catching running backs, you sort of lock yourself into that team when you start with a quarterback. Whether it's Dak Prescott or Aaron Rodgers, any end of the spectrum, I think most DFS players are trying to take advantage of these highly correlated fantasy point positions, quarterback, wide receiver being the obvious top one. So you're looking at Randall Cobb or Jordy Nelson or perhaps both, I think, when you start with Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah, I'm certainly looking at Randall Cobb, and the joke of Twitter is Jared Cook, but you know what? I might throw him in there as well, and I'm not going to feel bad about it. And you can't make me, because that's my decision. That's my decision tree process. No,
yeah, I know. Maybe this will be the year for Jared Cook.
It's year like 9, but it might be the year, guys.
This could be the
one. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I guess in terms of mid-priced running backs, what do you see there?
Well, I think this is actually a really fun starting point because you can go so many different directions. When you start with mid-priced running backs that have a high floor and high upside, guys like Mark Ingram is probably my favorite. Latavius Murray has gotten a ton of attention. You can expect pretty high ownership, I think, of both of those players. But you can go from there with a pretty solid core at running back to stars and scrubs. You can do the Dak Prescott, Des Bryant. You can do a more middle of the road approach. There's just so many ways that you can go from here. If you start out with two, median priced running backs that are in line for, 20 plus touches easily in high scoring games.
Right. So maybe in terms of if you're not totally sure where to go, maybe start out by, throwing to a Latavius Murray versus New Orleans. I mean, I love that game, so I definitely agree there. Maybe throw them in there and sort of see where the salary takes you after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, you can fit Drew Brees, you can fit Aaron Rodgers if you do that. You have to make some sacrifices somewhere, but there are cheap defenses I like this week. The Browns defense against Carson Wentz, who we just giggled at, it makes a lot of stuff possible.
Yeah, certainly.
This week. And they're an average defense in terms of sacks and turnovers. They're not great, but in the fantasy stats, they're not the worst either. They're not as bad as their price suggests, particularly this week.
Absolutely. And I think one of the big hinge points of the slate is Spencer Ware. I mean, unless Jamal Charles plays or something. And I think you could get some pretty good leverage on the Ware ownership if you play guys like Latavius Murray, who's, he's relatively cheap on both sites. So yeah. I think he's the nice guy you might want to look at that still isn't killing you for price, but has a pretty high floor as well.
Yep. He is the guy. I mean, everyone's DeAndre Washington. Yeah, Latavius Murray is the guy. And Derek Carr said nice things about him this week, which is always good to hear in terms of pass protection. So,
yeah, absolutely.
He's got the job for now.
I'm not buying the DeAndre Washington 5th round rookie running back hype, but different strokes for different folks, right?
Yeah, we may be saying it differently in week 12, but
no doubt. All right, well, that's some starting points for you guys to check out this week. Hopefully this helps. We're going to be here every week, so check us out next week as well. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, check out Daily Fantasy Cafe for all our great tools and content.
Have a great